Good evening and welcome to the Gold Coats and Guns Hour here on YouTube and DLive. My name is Tom Luongo. It's Friday. It's May 17th. Sorry, I've lost a day or two. 2019, and we'll get started in just a second while we wait for a few people to get into the stream and I get certain things taken care of. So tonight we're going to talk about a number of things that I haven't talked about in a while. I don't necessarily want to belabor some other points that I've been making recently. I want to talk about some different things overall. Let's get this thing framed and properly. Tonight we're not going to talk about as much current events to start out with as we normally do. And there's a number of reasons for that. The least of which is that I've been sick for the last couple of days. And it is what it is. And I've been like battling the stomach flu and sitting on the couch watching Babylon 5 reruns. And I haven't really been keeping up with current events because, well, I haven't been able to see straight for 24 hours. So it is what it is. Sorry I'm a little late. It is what it is, and these things happen. So tonight we're going to talk about, there's a lot of discussion always who's the greatest president of all time. And I've done this live stream before a couple times in the past. It's come up in the past, but never as an organized thing where it's in any way kind of will be archivable. It used to exist only on like Periscope and whatnot, and those Periscopes are now lost to the ether. So I wanted to do this again because I think it's because my argument for who's the greatest president of all time is actually germane, but it's germane to current events because it has to do with Donald Trump. Not that he's the greatest president of all time, because he's not even close. But it's germane to the way Trump is handling his current problems. And I'm not going to get into that to begin with. I'm going to sandbag this a little bit. And those of you who have been following me for a while know who I'm going to say. Whenever you talk about this, it's always the presidents that presided over the most important periods in this country's history, and invariably it's always the most statist sons of bitches who ever walked the face of the earth. This is the tyrants like Lincoln and FDR and the rest of them that are the greatest presidents, and not the ones who didn't advance the American state in the most egregious ways imaginable. Well, side note, Jonathan, this is not about you. I'm speaking to one of my commenters. These streams are not for you. They're for the other 100 people and for the other 3,000 people who are going to watch them. And Trump wants to be a figure that is constantly in the news and constantly be the center of attention. Well, guess what? Trump's going to be the center of attention every once in a while. I get to pick the topics, and that's just the way it is. You don't have to like it. Have a nice day. And I say that to everybody. I don't mean you or anybody else. This is when it comes down to it. I'm not going to be told what the content is. Period. And I feel very strongly about that. And honestly, you can keep those comments to yourselves because I don't really care. I'll tell you once, and then after that, I'm not going to respond to it anymore. So we're going to talk about this stuff tonight because we'll really start to talk about great presidents. It all depends on your point of view. And your point of view depends on who you are. And from a historian's perspective, and certainly from the perspective of, I hate to say this, from Marxist perspective, from Marxist historians' perspective, and most historians today are in some way, manner, shape, or form, are all incredibly statist. Very few of them are actually hardcore praxeologists, only interested in the facts, only interested in history, and willing to look at things from an objective perspective. They have bad understanding of economics. They have a bad understanding of the interplay of global finance. They have a bad understanding of history themselves. Being historians, they can't even make the connections. Most of them are agenda-driven sycophants for a particular political agenda. And I'm thinking about and if you look at the supposedly great historians of the last, the great historians that everybody studies now, or that we've been told are the great ones. And then we're talking about, people like, they've all been discredited over the years. People like Doris Kearns Goodwin, for example, is a classic example of one who would who wrote nothing but hagiographies of people like FDR and Lincoln, and were just terrible. And then it turns out that they were all just plagiarists in the end, even. And so we're going to go over some of the reasons why these guys are considered great presidents. Like, why is Lincoln considered a great president? Because he kept the Union together. Well, if you're a Unionist style historian who believes in Bismarckian nation states and which is the dominant political ideology of the day, until the recent time where now we're going to tear down the nation state and go for global government. When you look at it, history from the perspective of a Marxian perspective on power, for example, guys like Lincoln and FDR, Teddy Roosevelt and others are considered brilliant because they made the hard choices. Churchill, for example, another leader who's lionized, not necessarily for the right reasons. Was it worth what Lincoln did to save the Union? I have this argument with friends for years who are great integrationists and said Lincoln had to, destroy the Union in order to save it. I'm like, yeah, it's not much of an argument. So, the standard libertarian answer to this question, the hardcore libertarians will say people like Calvin Coolidge or Warren Harding as the greatest American presidents, because under their terms, they didn't expand the state. They worked assiduously to not respond to economic depressions. In the case of Harding, right, he was known as Do Nothing Harding, and did nothing during the depression of 1920-21, right? Just ignored it. Said, no, it'll work itself out, and it did, and everything was fine, right? Coolidge, similarly. Coolidge, unfortunately, sat there while the Fed was inflating the money supply, though, insanely. And then when the sovereign debt crisis hit in Europe in late 29, early 1930, there was nothing for Coolidge to do. Then it was left to Woodrow Wilson to do to make the wrong moves, and then after that, FDR came to power, and then forget it. We were all Keynesians after that. But Coolidge stood by during a period of terrible central bank policy, right? That first they were too loose during the 20s and then too tight during the 30s, and they didn't know what to do. Martin Armstrong keeps saying that that they should have just not done anything. He actually makes apologies for them. It's kind of sad. Tin Man on DLive brings up the point that historians who are paid by the state or educated by the state almost are always going to be pro-state. A very much a salient argument, and there's nothing worse, honestly, in this age there's nothing worse in this age of baby boomers having these grand visions of baby boomers are the prophet generation under the Strauss and Howe model of the four turnings, right? The prophet generation is the one that kind of sets the tone for the entire four generation cycle, and they always look back to invariably they always look back to the great champions of the previous cycles to go, oh, well, that's who we want to model things after. And they always look back to, people look at people like Steven Spielberg, like the quintessential baby boomer filmmaker, has an unbelievable blind spot for World War II and Abe Lincoln. The only times he ever really touched American history were, to make Saving Private Ryan and his schmaltzy hagiography of Lincoln, which is insane. So, but Lincoln was a tyrant. Lincoln was praised by Hitler in the prelude to in the forward to Mein Kampf, for Christ's sake. Lincoln was a tyrant. He did exactly what he needed to do to save the Union. And I don't make any excuses for anything that Lincoln did. I don't excuse him for what he did. He should have let the Union fall. It would have been better for everybody. It would have been better for everybody in the long run. Might not have been better for that generation of slaves here in the United States. But I think in the long run, we could argue that the American empire today, de facto, creates just, if not de facto, has created more slavery in many ways than existed back in the 1860s. And we now have the return of like slave auctions and slave auctions and failed states that we've created through our interventions. And there's now chattel slavery all over Africa again. So it is what it is. Well, Juan Isaac is saying, despite what revisionist historians say about calling Lincoln the worst of presidents, the USA today would not have been the superpower it is today without him. That's kind of my argument. It's kind of my argument. The United States being the superpower it is today. Think about that history. So now we look at the presidents who were despised by historians. I've already mentioned two of them, Coolidge and Harding. Other ones, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter inherited a terrible post-inflationary recession that was none of his fault. Arthur Burns was the worst Fed chairman in history, who inflated the money supply ridiculously after Nixon took us off the gold standard, after Nixon finally closed the gold window, after Nixon's poor policies, instituting the EPA, wage and price controls, and other things that Nixon put on, the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. We can go on and on and on. All these things happened under Nixon, and then Ford didn't do anything about it. You know, Carter inherited a terrible economy and a country in an economic and cultural malaise that was all a holdover of the Nixon administration and the Johnson administrations, and going back to Kennedy. You know, those bills had to be paid for. Guns and butter eventually had to be paid for, and they were paid for during the Carter administration. One could argue that the seeds were sown for Ronald Reagan to come in and do what he did. And I'm not gonna poop on Reagan's parade or anything, because I think that Reagan did a lot of things right and he did a lot of things wrong. I think by then the deep state was far too advanced and for any one man to try and stop it. Then I think that if you look at the totality of Reagan's record, despite the hagiography by modern day boomer Republicans, you will see a presidency that's going to look an awful lot like Donald Trump's. So this is going to be a controversial one, but I want you guys to understand the perspective I'm coming from, which is that giving money and power to governments is like, and the immortal words of PJ O'Rourke, is like giving, a bottle of whiskey and car keys to a teenager. You don't do that. And, when you look at the damage that was done to this country legally during Reconstruction. Now, I get a lot of flack from this, even from good friends of mine who are historians and better historians than I am. And I just look at it and I go, yeah, but you're missing the larger economic points. You're missing the larger, the bigger picture. We stand today on the edge of a sovereign debt crisis. This is the beginning of the fourth turning that we're in. We stand on the edge of a sovereign debt crisis, and the first phase of which is now unfolding in front of us, which is a strong move into the U.S. dollar as a safe haven move because of the massive synthetic short created against the dollar because of more than 10 years worth of QE and ridiculous amounts of money printing and insanely low zero-bound interest rates. And we're faced with a president who's starting a trade war with everybody he can get his hands on because he doesn't have a policy. He just thinks everybody's his enemy in a classic late-stage imperial paranoid mindset that everybody's our enemy. And if you disagree with me, then I'm going to use my imperial power to punish you even more until you submit. And that's been Trump's attitude, and that's been Trump's policy. And like it or not, whether you think he's a slave to his handlers or his masters, it doesn't matter. He's doing it, and it's going to be laid upon him. And you can make excuses for him, but this is where we are. At the end of the day, he is still president. And he could still use that power, and he could just fire these people tomorrow, and there's not a lot they could do about it. They can offer him worse people, but so what? He can keep firing them too until he gets to somebody who doesn't suck. So, the interesting part about all of this is, so when you look at what's happening with Trump, Trump is a great champion, right? He is that character in American history now. He's going to be that great disruptor. He's going to change things in some way. He's going to be that change agent that ushers in the next era, and for better or for worse. Okay? And by definition, he can't possibly be a great president, because it's invariably, those are the ones that invariably do more harm than good. Certainly in the four or five iterations of this that we've gone through in the history of the United States, it's pretty obvious at this point that all of them, including Andrew Jackson, would be the one previous to that. I think it's Andrew Jackson. It's a little early for that. I think it's probably, I'm not sure. That nothing's ever gotten better. It's always been on a pro-state process. So it's better for us to look at the guys who came just before them. Now, let's look at Barack Obama. Don't make me laugh. Barack Obama is just another in a long series of terrible presidents like George Bush the Lesser, or Bill Clinton, or George H.W. Bush, or the rest of them. Herbert Hoover? No, Herbert Hoover was just like Obama. He was unprepared for the situation he found himself in when the crisis began to erupt. And maybe Trump's not really the great champion here. Maybe he's more of a Hoover-like figure, making all the wrong moves. Actually, that might actually be better. That Trump may not actually be that character. And I think about it, he may be more like a Hoover figure, making all the wrong moves. Hoover instituted the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which created untold amounts of dislocation in global trade, which dropped money velocity like a rock, and global trade contracted, and that precipitated the sovereign debt crisis. Does it sound familiar? Because it sounds real familiar to me. So here's the question I have, and this is where I come from. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I'm talking now for 18 minutes. The most despised president by all accounts, all nominally statist historians, the ones who are always asked about this list every time these lists get published and people talk about it. The person who always winds up at the bottom of the list, top of the list, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, FDR, within the top three. They go back and forth, but they always say the same thing. Who's at the bottom? It's Buchanan. And I will tell you that from my perspective, Buchanan was the greatest of presidents. And I'm going to give you two major reasons why, and they're going to take a couple of minutes for me to lay out. And this is incredibly controversial. James Buchanan was the greatest president of this country's history because he presided over two very important events. And we're going to start with the Panic of 1857. And I know, Juan Isaac, you are like looking at me like I got four heads. Give me the next 5 minutes. Buchanan tried to stop the war by not having it happen. Buchanan presided over the Panic of 1857, which was the first transcontinental financial crisis. Do you remember that? The Panic of 1857 is widely recognized as the first transcontinental financial panic. And Buchanan's response to it was to not bail out the banks. His response to the Panic of 1857 was to shore up the state banks, make sure they had enough currency to stay solvent, to allow for local business to continue operating, exactly what he was supposed to do, and let the banks work this out amongst themselves. Banks in Ohio went busto, which then railroad banks in Ohio went bust, which then bankrupted banks in New York, which then bankrupted banks in the Netherlands and Germany and UK and London and the rest of it. And they all went bust, and they all couldn't figure out what to do. And liquidity was gone. The banks were a mess. And they all screamed for Buchanan to bail them out, and he refused to do so. Buchanan was a constitutionalist to the core. He was probably the most rigorously assiduous constitutionalist in this country's history. He was as strong a constructionist as there has ever been. Jefferson wasn't that strong a constructionist. The Louisiana Purchase is widely considered to be far in excess of his authority. And yet he did it anyway. Man wrote the fucking document, couldn't even abide by it. Buchanan did. In Panic of 1857, he set the blueprint for how to go about dealing with banks who were out of control. Panic of 1857 never hit the general economy. Yeah, there were a lot of banks that had to close for over a month to get their affairs in order. Yes, there were some people who were creditors of those banks and depositors of those banks who were inconvenienced. Absolutely, no argument. But the panic itself was contained, because of James Buchanan, to those banks and only those banks. And it did not involve the federal government. Fast forward to 1860, he is now despised within his own party. The Democratic Party splits in order to ensure that a railroad lawyer would be running against a railroad lawyer in the election of 1860, Douglas versus Lincoln. The Democratic Party, in revenge for Buchanan's handling of the Panic of 1857, ousted him from contention. The Whigs imploded. The Republicans took over. And remember, Lincoln was not elected on a first ballot in 1860. He was elected by the House of Representatives. He didn't win a majority of electoral votes. The country was split in 1860. We forget these things today. But Buchanan, in his last act as president, before Lincoln took office, and Lincoln took office much later than, if I remember correctly, Lincoln took office, back then they took office much later than January 20th. I think he didn't take office until almost March. And so when the first states seceded from the Union, Buchanan said, okay, I have no authority to stop them, because he correctly interpreted the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution as saying all the powers and everything else that's not explicitly written down in this document is not a power of the United States federal government. It was Lincoln who interpreted the document differently. And the Civil War settled it as a matter of law afterwards, during Reconstruction. But Buchanan, in those two acts, he could have, in order to stop the violence, because he saw a war, and he was like, I'm not going to prosecute a war here. I'm not going to do this. They're wrong. I don't want them to be slave states. I don't want them to be slaves. But it is not within my power to stop them from seceding from the Union. Now, that's of course interpreted by fascist fucking historians today as weak and ineffectual. Not as, in the same way that they say that the Articles of Confederation were weak and ineffectual. The Articles of Confederation were, of course, weak and ineffectual. The states were supposed to be sovereign. The problem was, back in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, that the United States government couldn't pay its debts, its war debt. And so its currency blew up, and therefore the government blew up. And they had to create confidence among the creditors. And the only way to do that was to rewrite the whole thing as a stronger constitution. And this is effectively, and this is in many ways why Hamilton won. Buchanan was the last great Federalist. Madison and Jefferson both wrote. I know that Madison wrote most of the Constitution, but don't kid yourself. So Jefferson had a strong hand in it. So it's by that argument alone that when you think about you think about what happened, it was a financial panic from a massively corrupt expansion of the railroad industry under previous administrations that led to a massive classic Austrian business cycle boom-bust cycle, Austrian business cycle theory boom-bust cycle that then ushered in a political revolution of tyrants. And it was the election of 1860 was the first election where no matter who won, the people lost because the banks were going to win. And that's a very cynical view of it, but it is hard for me to get away from. I know this is unpopular, but understand that. So to me, no other president, and Johnson's asking me about Grover Cleveland. I'm like, I don't know a goddamn thing about Grover Cleveland because Grover Cleveland wasn't president in a time that mattered. The period between 1855 and 1857 and 1861, when Lincoln took office, was the most important period in our history. These were the most important 5 years of America's history. It's when everything changed. It's when America went from being a federated republic to an empire, or to a nascent empire. It's when state Supreme Courts lost their supremacy. It's when the supremacy clause of the United States the United States Constitution was completely reinterpreted. Everything changed in that period and in the 10 years after the Civil War. And to me, Buchanan had, in his way, and there's arguments against this, that he was just such a weak person that he didn't want to make the decision, and I don't buy that at all. Because that's the argument people make about him not wanting to deal with the southern states. They make this argument that Buchanan didn't want to be the one, didn't want to make a decision, yada, 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 and he was trying to make everybody happy and all of that stuff. And I was like, no, I don't think that was the case at all. I think Buchanan knew exactly what he was doing, knew exactly that he couldn't stop the southern states from leaving, and actually didn't want the southern states to stay if they didn't want to be in the Union, because it wasn't within his purview to do it. And he handled the Panic of 1857, and his handling of the Panic of 1857 gives you the clue as to how he interpreted his authority as president. Now, Herbert Hoover didn't do much during the beginning of the Great Depression except put on more tariffs. Start the works. Hoover did exactly what Trump is doing. He started the Works Project Administration, the WPA. Guess what? Guess what the New Deal is? It's the WPA on steroids. All FDR's New Deal is the WPA squared with more money, because FDR devalued gold by 75%, which is what he needed to do. So, And when capital was flowing into the United States too quickly, Hoover tried to stop it by putting on a massive tariff. Oops, didn't work. He tried to slow down the capital flight out of Europe. It didn't work. Blew the whole world economy up. Guess what? Trump is doing the exact same thing. The exact same thing. Do I know anything about the CSA Constitution? Not really. And then the carpetbaggers following 1865. I mean, the way the southern states were forced back into the Union to accept the Constitution, even though their voting rights under it had been suspended, the whole thing was completely tyrannical. It was insane. Ike doesn't get respect because he inherited a good period. That's true. He inherited the post-war boom period, which was always going to happen on that person's watch. Good evening, hi Akaton. How are you? Ike should get a lot of credit for steering things in the didn't Truman slash the U.S. budget hugely? Yes, but he also put on wage and price controls, and that caused a number of other problems. Well, I mean, the war budget was so insane it didn't matter. By Truman cutting the budget, he didn't cut it back to pre-war levels, though. It was still, relative to pre-war levels, the U.S. federal budget was still much, much higher. Bob Higgs and Tom Woods did a lot of great work on this, and he wound up, but he also wound up putting on wage and price controls because there was massive inflation, and that created the entire wage and price structure that we have today, where people started getting time off. Because when we had wage and price controls on, in order to properly bid for labor, then what did we wind up doing? Well, the employers had to start offering benefits. 2 weeks off, sick time, health insurance. These were the enticements. They weren't allowed to just pay people dollars. They had to pay them in other forms because of wage and price controls put in effect under Truman. And that actually is what starts us on the long, terrible road towards where we are today, which is we've got now conservatives saying, well, yeah, maybe we should just give everybody Medicaid for all. All right? Give me a fucking break. At these prices, silver is a gift. Darth Hypatia asks a question that I can't answer, which is there any connection between the anti-Masonic sentiment and the Civil War? Yeah. My history on that stuff is not strong enough. I'm thinking about these things from when I look at the big stuff. I mean, when I look at it from what moves global capital, right? My 67-year-old mom has been buying a few $100s of silver every year. She has a fair number of coins, says Juan Isaac. Well, that's fantastic. She's in good shape. What conservatives are? The Mitt Romneys of the world. It's called Romney Care. It's called Obamacare, which is just Romney Care repackaged. Okay, we're at the point now where when you look at the situation that we have now is so terrible that the next best thing is to say, well, the easiest thing to do now would just be to give everybody freaking Medicare, which is exactly what they wanted in the first place. What about platinum? Do the supply and demand numbers on platinum and get back to me. Ours and D's, there haven't been conservatives in this country for a long time. So that's my argument for why James Buchanan is the greatest president of all time. It's the moment in time that he covered. It's the two major events in America, and really in financial and American history together. It's the confluence of and the consolidation of the banking industry's power in the United States. It's all of that. And he tried to stop it. And the forces were beyond his control even then. And then we waged the bloodiest war in this country's history. And it's sold to us today, 130 years or 150 years later, as a war as a war to free slaves. And that is not what it was about at all. It was about the tariff of abomination. It was about states' rights. It was about stopping the northern industrial banks from consolidating power within Washington. It was about so many other things than slavery. Slavery would have ended on its own here in the United States, including in the South. It's a ridiculously uneconomic and unsustainable economic system certainly compared to any kind of open free market for labor. The rest of the world had done away with chattel slavery without violence, either through immediate reparations, paying off slave owners, whatever they had to do to get it done. And it's only the United States that fought a bloody civil war for it. So I don't buy that argument, never have. Mark Bogosian said, "Hooray, I am sold. Hooray, Buchanan. Huzzah." It's one Isaac. It's more to it than that. Of course, it would not have been. Our history would have been completely different. There's no argument about these. There's no argument that it would have been an easy thing to end slavery in the South. But certainly without the bloody conflict and without the consolidation of power that took place in Washington after the Civil War, one could argue that that World Wars I and II would not have happened. So, yeah, Tom DiLorenzo's. If you have not read the great the Real Lincoln by Tom DiLorenzo, I heartily recommend it to you. Yeah, Glenn Horowitz brings up the point that Tom DiLorenzo stresses that again and again, that compensated emancipation would have been doable, more than doable, and it would have, and the market forces would have modernized would have forced a modernization of the labor markets in the South over time. It would have happened. And it's a, the farther we get away from it, the more cartoonish our discussions about it are. Yes. Yeah, remember that. Remember this: that the Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln was seen at the time as a cheap political stunt by everyone, including the northern newspapers that were behind him, and certainly in Europe. Yep. And Reconstruction was so terrible. Well, what was truly terrible was that in many ways, you could argue that the freed slaves in the North, pre-Civil War, and even to a greater extent post-Civil War, were in even worse shape than the slaves were in the South. And this is a really controversial point. And I'm not even sure I even buy this argument. But let's take it one step further, because you have to remember that at the end of the day, there was no interracial marriage. Right, marriage licenses were instituted to stop misogyny or stop miscegenation, mixed race marriages, right? And they weren't for public health reasons. That's what that's sold to us today. It's not what it was for, right? They couldn't enter into contracts with whites. They couldn't enter into. They had no legal recourse to settle claims against white people. They weren't full citizens. In any practical sense, they were freed slaves, but they weren't full citizens. This was true for a long time in the great liberated North. At least down south, you had somebody to advocate for you. Up north, they didn't have anybody. In New York, they didn't have anybody. You know, they weren't slaves anymore, but you know they couldn't partake of the actual all the quote unquote benefits of society. At least down south, if if you beat up one of my slaves, I had right of recompense. I don't know. Maybe this isn't something we should be talking about on YouTube anymore. Look at my channel shut down. Southern historians had the origins of the Civil War right, because they lost the war, so we get the Northern version. Again, Juan Isaac with lots of truth. Everybody's Lincoln. So Jonathan Gillespie says that Dinesh D'Souza's films are way overrated. That's yes. And his Lincoln film is propaganda. Everybody's Lincoln film is propaganda. Okay? No one tells an even close to rational story about Lincoln. It's just not allowed to be taught anymore. Glenn Horowitz, gun control was specifically pushed to disarm black people to prevent them from avoiding post-slavery depredations. Marriage licensing is bullshit. You shouldn't know. I mean, the state should not be involved at all in your marriage. Is there one film that gets the Civil War history right? I don't know. There may be, but if so, I haven't seen it yet. Of course, I don't search them out anymore, so I don't really care. Was Lincoln gay? I have no idea. Blacks were pulling themselves up right until the 1960s. Then, bam, the family destroying Great Society. As I like to say, what 350 years worth of chattel slavery couldn't destroy, 30 years of welfare did. The black family. Where I live up here in North Florida, I live in all family-owned land. It's all owned by a particular family. All the streets are named after these people. All the lots are owned by the same family. I bought my lot from one brother, and the other brother owns another 40 acres, and this one owns 40 acres, and the road's named after the grandfather, and all of this stuff. And it's pretty obvious that, you know, this family probably fought on the side of the North in the Civil War, and one of the things they got for fighting was, you know, they usually gave a 640 acre tract of land, which is a square mile. I can't remember what the hell they call it now. There was a particular term for that in compensation, and it was, of course, over the course of time, it was just divided up amongst family members and everything else. And I'm almost positive that this tract of land that I live on today was part of that. And, you know, when I look around, and all of my neighbors are, you know, members of this family, and they're all great people. They're all wonderful people. Yeah, I know it's called a section, but I know what that's in surveying terms. I don't remember what it was called in terms of, there was another, I think there was another term for it in terms of the compensation package, El Vicaro. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It was, a 640 acre thing is called a section, which is a square mile, 1 mile square, 640 acres. And a quarter section is a quarter mile, which is, you know, 160 acres, yada, yada, yada. It was more than 40 acres in a mule. You got a lot more than 40 acres for that. Well, depending on who you were. So. Does my land have a name? Yeah, it's called Pirate Dog Acres. And Pirate Dog just died. We eulogized Calvin last week. He was the original Pirate Dog. Yep. We searched long and hard for a name. Gold, Goats, and Guns is a later iteration of that. came later. But yeah, we called this place Pirate Dog Acres because we had a one-eyed guardian dog named Calvin. He was the original pirate dog. Does that involve barking or arguing? Arg. He never did arg. He barked a lot. He did bark, and we never did get him an eye patch. And I said well, I've always said that. Yeah. So James says on YouTube, he says my Central Florida property name is no trespassing. Well, I got one for even better for you. Right? Is that for years we thought if we had to divvy up our property anymore, right? You know, if we wanted to like divide it into 5-acre or 2-acre sections or whatever, and then parcels and then sell them all off, we would have to go through subdivision rules to upgrade the incoming road and turn it into a county road, and then upgrade my driveway would have to then be, you know, I could then name my driveway Go Away, GOA Way. I think that's a perfectly good name. And it's a double entendre. You got Gun Owners of America, Goa Way. I'm like, seems reasonably good to me. So I would have named it Go Away. I can't get away from the puns, dude. You know that. Oh, sorry. What was this? Oh God, you guys are talking about something very cool. Jeff, have you guys seen the Luke Rudkowski, Jeff Berwick vids on Cherán? I guess it's a town in Mexico. They did throw out politicians and cops and armed patrols that made up a lot of the local private security. Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that. The safest town in Mexico kicked the Mexican government and police out. It speaks volumes. You're right. So, yeah, Cherán has citizens actively, openly carrying weapons. Seems like a very cool place to live, to be honest with you. You know, an armed society is a polite society. Because at the end of the day, I'm like, if everybody's packing, I'm like, hi, man, how are you? How's your kids? I'm like, I'm not going to be getting in anybody's face going, dude, you're an asshole. I'm like, we only act like that shit when we know the other guy's not going to punch back. Not hard. The road to our county dump is named Throw It Away. Nice. Oh, I love it. Nice. It's a Michoacán? Interesting. Are there... Nice. You guys are making me salivate here. I mean, I live in an area of North Florida, which is... I don't see a lot of cops where I live, to be honest with you. I just don't. I see them on the roads. When I drive into town, I have to drive by, you know, anywhere from 3 to 5 of them as they're all like, you know, perched like jaguars in a tree, just waiting for a goat to drive to come by to pounce on, so that they can give people tickets and pay their, you know, their kids' college tuition. But other than that, all right, I got about 10 minutes. What else do you guys want to talk about tonight? So, I was going to tie a lot of this back to my. I never see them at the donut shop, to be honest with you. I always just see them out by the side of the road, trying to pick people off. I know where they all hang out, so it's not like it's hard. So I was going to tie this back to remind you that we are looking at the same kinds of situation, at the same moment in time as the time leading up to the Civil War, time leading up to the Great Depression, with president making similar mistakes. And one wishes that Trump would be less Hoover and more Buchanan, but I don't see it. So I don't see it. Well, this stream might be a lot less tense than Monday night, but Monday night's stream got rave reviews, so and brought in a lot of new. Well, I lost a lot of subscribers, and I brought new ones in as well. So it is what it is. I don't mind. I don't care. Right? I've come to the conclusion. The audience tonight is also much smaller. I've noticed that it's important to kind of clear people out every once in a while. It just is. So, all right, we're at 50 minutes. I got a couple of things I want to talk about before I leave. I'm going to be busy writing for most of the weekend, trying to catch up for the last 2 days, having sat on the couch and watched Babylon 5 for the last 2 days. By the way, I'll tell you what was it's a shame. Like, I'm watching B5 is one of my favorite shows of all time, and it's because it's storytelling in grand fashion. Its politics are all almost exactly correct. Straczynski may be a lib, but he's a classic lib. He's not a shit lib. At least he wasn't when he wrote Babylon 5. I don't know where he is today. I really could give a crap. I'm watching certain subplots play out within B5, and I'm like, shit's here today. Right? I'm like right hip deep in the end of season 2, and for those of you who haven't seen it, for those who have seen it, we're right. The Night Watch just got introduced, right? And that whole subplot it's playing itself out here. The justifications for the Night Watch are exactly the same as we're seeing from Facebook and Twitter and everything else, to push the censorship and self-censorship and trying to protect the society from dangerous ideas, challenging ideas, the status quo, all that stuff. So many good things in there. So many good things about the use of power and how you use it responsibly and all of that. And it's just, and it is a shame that Warner Brothers has treated it so shabbily over the years, that 25 years on, we're 25 years from when B5 was first aired, and they've never done a cleanup on it, and they've never done a proper treatment of it in even 720p, no less 1080p. The graphics are dated now and everything else, but it could still be at least updated so that the CGI background shots wouldn't be blurry, because they're in 480p on my 4K television set. And the way they've been cobbled together is just criminal. And the masters are there. They have the money. It's been a franchise that's made them enough money that they should, and that there's still enough love for the show that they would, if they were to put out a properly remastered version of it, and that would be available for us to stream or to buy on Blu-ray, we would buy it. And there's all the material that's out there, and there's all the interviews that they could cobble together and put out a beautiful package for it. It's groundbreaking television in terms of long-form storytelling and everything else. And it tells a story that needs to be, that people need to get in touch with on a regular basis. Unlike Game of Suck, which I'm about to watch episode 5 of season 8 of when I get done with the stream, which has completely shat the bed in season 8. And I talked about it in this month's newsletter, and I'm going to talk about it again next week after the final episode airs, and explain to everybody just why it sucks. For those of you who feel betrayed and don't understand why season 8 of Game of Thrones is so bad, well, I can tell you that, and I'm going to tell you why, probably in a series of articles over the next, over the next week or so. So, I have seen Firefly, Glenn Horowitz, and here's the thing about Firefly. I don't know if you've watched it recently, but I did. I watched it recently, and what's funny about Firefly is that it feels individualist and voluntarist, but it's not. It's Joss Whedon, who's a shit lib through and through, writing what he thinks a libertarian and a voluntarist sounds like. Mal Reynolds doesn't actually ring true. He did when it first aired and I was watching it. We were starving for non-leftist crap on television. Mal Reynolds was awesome, right? And Nathan Fillion's interpretation of Whedon's dialogue is fantastic. But the dialogue itself, Give me a fucking break. It's like, I can't write Marxists, okay? I can't do it. I'm not a Marxist. If I were to write Marxists, it would just come out sounding like some asshole libertarian writing a cartoon Marxist. Well, when I watch Firefly today, that's how Mal feels to me. It feels like that. B5. Never. B5 moves in a completely takes a completely different tact, and it deals with all of those great themes about the use of power, the proper role of the state, the proper role of government. Straczynski makes no argument that he believes in governments reflecting the will of the people and all of this stuff. He doesn't make any arguments about that. And if there's a weak spot to Babylon 5, it's of course the last season, where after all the wars are fought, then the natural empire building comes after that. And it's the biggest weakness is the fact that he's only got 15 episodes worth of friggin' story, and he's got 22 episodes to fill, 21 episodes to fill. That's the biggest problem. Then there's the budget cuts and all the other things. And when you stop to really think about it, as I got older and I watched Firefly again, I'm like, the show's good, but it's not that good. And, I'm glad it is what it is. No, I wasn't expecting that. I love a lot of Rob Reiner's early work, for example. Glenn, don't get me wrong. I quote the friggin' Princess Bride. It's the most quotable movie of all time. Love The Sure Thing. Love Spinal Tap. Love When Harry Met Sally. I like a lot of Rob's work. I don't take his politics and graft it onto the movie. I really do walk in without any blinders from that perspective. Whedon's work, honestly, watch Firefly carefully and you'll see what I'm talking about. And it just really rubs me the wrong way because it's so obviously written by somebody who doesn't believe in those words. And so that's the way it comes out. And the dialogue coming out of Mal's mouth, the writer doesn't believe it. The actor makes it work because Nathan Fillion is awesome. No doubt. I love Nathan Fillion. He's fantastic. Everything I've ever seen him in. Really enjoy his work. And he makes it sing. But the writer doesn't. And as a writer, I can tell. So maybe I have a much higher standard than others. And I can't help it as a structuralist, as a writer, I can't help it. So I get it. I love Mal. He's fantastic. But not as written. Yeah, Joss is the Alliance. It's like, I'm a big fan of Ian Banks's The Culture novels. I don't know if you guys if you're a real science fiction geek, you know who I'm talking about. And Ian Banks is was one of the most talented writers of all time. He's a Scottish Marxist. Okay, and the Culture books are these fantastic, various novels. It's set in this far future. And the first one in the series is called "Consider Phlebas," which is a quote from, which is a reference to "The Wasteland" by T.S. Eliot. It's "Consider Phlebas a fortnight dead," and then there's that whole section in the Wasteland devoted to that. And "Consider Phlebas, he's been dead a fortnight," something like that. And it's a great book, and I remember reading it for the first time, and I remember reading the whole thing, and I got to the end of "Consider Phlebas," and it's this whole thing, the culture itself is like the perfect Marxian expression of Marxian ideology versus the individualist adherents, and our protagonist is a shape changer who winds up fighting on their side, and it all works out in the end that they get wiped out, and Horza, the main character, gets wiped out, and everything else, and it's told. And the epilogue is told in such a way that you almost feel like the the author, the narrator, is telling you what happened wistfully, right? I read this book thinking this guy Banks is like one of the great libertarians of all time. No, he turns out he's a fucking classic Scottish Marxist of this generation. Like, he actually personally sides with the culture. And I'm like, the culture is anathema to everything that makes me want to, like, continue breathing. So, that's how good a writer he is. Joss Whedon isn't anywhere close to in this class. Now, again, for me, when I watched Firefly the first time, I didn't know. I thought, Whedon was, hey, maybe he's actually a classical lib. And then it turns out he's just, and then his work has gotten worse as it's gotten old. Don't get me wrong. I mean, if Firefly comes on, or if somebody wants to like throw it on and watch them, I watch them and I like them. But I also feel like I also have this is the last thing I'll say before I leave. One of the things that really bothers me about Firefly, and is that Whedon, after the show was canceled, had every opportunity to take that show private and start this, and start the process of breaking from the networks. But he wanted to direct movies. And he wasn't going to bite the hand that fed him by going out and taking Firefly, which had a massive built-in audience that would have easily crowdfunded a second season for him, streamed on the internet or whatever, and it would have absolutely worked. And he didn't do it. He didn't have the courage of his convictions because he wanted to direct movies. That television for him was always just a stepping stone to something else. And I'm firmly convinced that he screwed the pooch on that, and I'm firmly convinced that he didn't care enough about Firefly, and that he just milked that and milked all of his fans in order to get where he wanted to go. And that eventually he was able to get, and that he had the opportunity, and that Serenity, the movie, was his way of getting what he wanted, which was to prove to everybody that he could be a bankable film director, which is what he wanted. That really bothered me. All right, I'm pretty much out of time, and I've got my wife standing by to go watch Game of Suck, so I'm going to go do that, and then I'm going to go pass out because you guys have no idea. I don't have any freaking energy left. All right, so you guys take care. We'll talk soon. If you like what you heard tonight, give a like and subscribe down below. If you want, please make a donation. You can do so. It's all in the links to this down below in the description of the video on YouTube. You can do so by PayPal or by Patreon or by installing the Brave browser and opting into Brave Rewards, which I expect everybody should do over the course of time. It would be very much to your benefit to start trying to break the Google monopoly and the Google panopticon. All right, you guys take care. You have a great evening. Probably a great weekend. I don't know how much time I'll have. I'll try and do a stream, say, Sunday afternoon, but I'm not making any guarantees. You be good. You be well. And keep your stick on the ice.